It's 7:07, and welcome to the public forum of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force meeting. Welcome to you in person. Welcome to those on Zoom tonight. So I'm the chair of the task force. My name is Paul Boehm. I'm here tonight with my entire task force, and we're going to spend the next probably about 60 to 90 minutes not listening to me, but listening to initial presentation, and then hopefully having a discussion about some of the issues that we'll bring up tonight and some of the issues that may be on your mind. But we would like to update you on where we've been since the last forum, which was held on November 9th, bringing you up to date on the work of the task force and the progress that we've made. So it is a follow-up to that previous forum, and at that forum, if we remember, we talked about what we were going to do and what the select board wanted us to take on, how we were going to accomplish our tasks, what questions we were going to try to answer, and the methods that we were going to try to use to answer those questions. So this is a follow-up. I do ask that you hold your questions until the end of the presentation, at which time I hope we can all have a good discussion. And at that point, we'll open it up, and all the task force will join in answering your questions. So to introduce the task force, and you see them in this Zoom screen here, I'm Paul Boehm. We have Kurt Herman, David Ropey, Gary Kleiman, Rich Feely, Carrie Flood, Carl Seidman, Court Booth, and Pam Hill. And this is a really valuable and a very important dedicated group because they brought scientific and environmental expertise, brought health perspectives, understanding risk and communicating risk. There's legal expertise on the task force. We have folks who are proficient in economic development. We have people who are very interested in and experts on housing perspectives, recreational perspectives, a deep knowledge of the town, its functions, its municipal interests, and the multi-stakeholder decision-making process. So I think I'm very pleased and proud to have been working with this group for about 13 months. It's important for us to seek public input, and we greatly value your input. This is the second of probably what will be 3 public hearings. There'll be one more towards the end of our work. And that's really an important reason for tonight's forum, to get your input and get your questions. So just a bit of review. Let's take a look at the 2229 Main Street site. And of course, this site has been known at various times as Nuclear Metals, NMI, and StarMet. So I'm going to refer tonight by its address, 2229 Main Street, even though that's a bit of a mouthful. So as the graphic indicates, the site sits in the midst of lots of things going on in West Concord. We're very close to the Acton town line, actually the junction of Acton, Maynard, and Concord on Main Street, Route 62. And it sits in the midst of housing. It sits in the midst of active recreation parcels, of conservation land, open space. We have the major residents of Thoreau Hills. We have Minuteman Arc. We have Valley Sports, the ice skating rink across the street. We have a shopping complex. So this is not sitting out in the wilderness. This is sitting smack dab in the midst of a lot of very valuable activities in town. You'll notice one thing, I drew a dotted line through the site. The site is approximately 46 acres, but I drew that dotted line just to indicate that about half of the site has never been used for manufacturing activities or waste disposal. It's really a conservation area. And then the other half of the site was used for manufacturing and waste disposal. So it's really a tale of two sites with different characters. I also circled what's new since the last time I presented this is the proposed 40B housing development called Residence at Thoreau. That is still in development, but that will take up part of the old Camp Thoreau open space area when that is finally detailed as far as what they're going to develop there. So additional housing will occur in the area. And just I always like this drone shot, which is taken looking west. So you see in the foreground, which is the I call the conservation area, with a little bit of plastic over a small waste disposal area. That area in the foreground is a sphagnum bog, one of the two bogs in Concord, a very valuable ecological resource. And then you see where the manufacturing has taken place. This is a drone shot from about 2020. The buildings had all been removed, and there's been a lot of work done at the site since this was taken. A tremendous amount of cleanup has occurred. So this is a bit of outdated, but it gives you a sense of the two distinct characters of the site. So the history of the site is very important and informs not only the timeline of the problem creation, but also the great efforts in investigating the problems created by the manufacturing operations, which occurred between 1958 and about 2011, when the site was abandoned by StarMed. And importantly, it also speaks to the process of finding solutions and restoring the land for productive uses. From 1980 to present, there's been an extensive series of ongoing investigations, first done by the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, and then later on by EPA. StarMed itself funded some of the cleanup till they ran out of money. So there's been lots of funds and lots of activity at the site with regards to investigation and cleanup since 1980. The site was designated a Superfund site. I'll go a little bit into that history, although some of the room may know a little bit more about that than I do. So that's really started the process of truly investigating the site and coming to the final cleanup solutions. But it took some time to get to that stage. We are in good company. There are about 1,300 Superfund sites in the country and about 31 in Massachusetts as of last counting. They all are unique. It's like snowflakes. They all have different challenges. Municipalities are involved in many of those, and towns and other entities are faced with what to do with these sites when they are cleaned up. The site was abandoned by StarMed in 2011, and that's when activities really could take place as far as cleanup. And by 2014, the EPA investigations, the remedial investigations, completed. So that was the point where there was many samples, and the initial look at the contamination of the site, the initial context for the cleanup was really known. So that was like 10 years ago, even though it's been a Superfund site since 2001. EPA used that information to come up with what's called the Record of Decision, and they set rigorous cleanup goals, which are called residential standards. We can talk more about those, but those are the most stringent standards that, if cleaned up, would allow for residential use, to allow for almost any use of the site, if those are achieved. In about that same time, in 2015, the town approved a town warrant, and I'll show you a little screenshot of that, which authorized the select board to actually acquire the site under certain conditions. So right now, that is sitting out there, and the select board is really faced with a decision, and that's why they have started this task force to advise them. 2019. So the final cleanup really couldn't get going full speed until there was an agreement, a legal agreement between all parties, the parties that caused the contamination, the parties that were charged with the cleanup, and that was a filed by the court, and the specifics of cleanup came into final focus with this consent decree. The consent decree is a legal agreement between the government and the parties that are held legally responsible for creating the problem and fixing it. This consent decree sets out agreements, financial trust funds to fund the cleanup elements, and the cleanup goals. But the detail of cleanup, if you've heard EPA talk about this, are dynamic. They continue to sample, they continue to excavate, they continue to expand the cleanup, and the cleanup continues, the costs of the cleanup continue as things were found. They really want to clean up this site, and what was known in 2014 was just a start for what is known today. The current task force is successor to a reuse committee, which was appointed by the select board to come up with a report on how the site might be reused. And you see the cover of that on the slide on the left. And that reuse report really set the stage for the this present task force, which got going in May of 2028. I should mention that based on what we know right now, the cleanup of this site will cost close to $300 million by the end of this decade. It's an approximation right now, and that cost keeps growing. So who is responsible for this cleanup? 98% of the responsibility is with entities of the federal government, the Department of Army and the Department of Energy. And this is really important. There's only 2% of the costs being borne by Textron and Whitaker, two of the initial funders and drivers of the initial research on specialty metals. But it was the Army and the Department of Energy that got StarMed into the business of depleted uranium. Depleted uranium tips on armaments, and depleted uranium is one of the contaminants of concern. So 98% of the cost is being borne by the government, i.e. the taxpayer. That's us indirectly. So one takeaway from this is the financial jeopardy of potential parties not being around in 10 years is slight, because 98% of this is government costs. There have been many eyes on the site and the cleanup for over 30 years, and many interested and dedicated and devoted citizens have been involved. The work really started with the Citizens Research and Environmental Watch crew, and other groups who were really instrumental in alerting the town and Mass DEP and ultimately EPA on the threats posed by the site, and getting the site to be ranked and put on the national priorities list, i.e. the Superfund list. The work of our task force is really built upon the spade work done by others, and we began our work in May of 2023, just over a year ago, after the Select Board developed the charge for the task force. So let me summarize what the Select Board has actually asked us to do. And it's a 3 or 4 page charge, and I'll just summarize it here, that the purpose of the task force is to recommend to the Select Board whether the town should acquire the property at 2229 Main Street. It's a little bit more detailed than that, because those decisions rest on a number of aspects, which we'll get into. It's not just yes or no. We have to find out a lot about the site, about legal aspects, about health aspects, et cetera. But remembering the public had previously authorized the Select Board, and here's a copy of the article that was approved, and you'll see that the property needed to be cleaned up to residential standards, and the purposes of reuse would follow the completion of components of ongoing work by the EPA. And I think that timeline, which I'll talk about a little later, still holds today. In reality, as I will explain, the task force will make a recommendation whether or not to proceed on a path towards acquisition. Let me say that again, whether or not to proceed on a path. So, and we haven't yet begun to consider the recommendation, so we're still digesting the information that you'll see tonight. And if our recommendation is to proceed on that path, we'll define for the Select Board that path as best we can. So why a path and not just an outright recommendation? That's because there are a number of questions that need to be answered and negotiations that need to take place after we are no longer a task force. And those questions, those answers and negotiations have to take place before a final decision is actually made by the Select Board to acquire or not the site. So I'll explain this path a bit as we go forward. So a decision, when we finish our work in October 31st of this year, there won't be the point where anybody decides we're going to acquire it or not. It'll be on the path towards acquisition or not on that path. I can explain more later if you have some questions. So the Select Board essentially defined our 4 overarching areas that needed to be addressed as part of any recommendation to them. And these four areas really define the 4 elements of our work, or the work streams, and this is how we organized our work. And they include legal aspects of acquisition decision, reuse aspects, what the site could be reused for, safety and risk, would the site be safe for reuse, and what would be the risks, if any, of people and being on the site after cleanup is done. And then the economics and responsibilities of ownership, called the operations and ownership. If the town were to acquire it, well, what are the obligations of the town financially and legally? So those are the 4 areas. The task force is doing its work and has conducted its research on these 4 elements with the help of others depicted here. This is quite an excellent team of people. So the task force has been dependent on if you start in the upper left, a consultant that was hired by the town, Rue Associates, to conduct the independent risk work. They were funded by a technical assistance grant from Mass DEP and also funded with ARPA money, the American Recovery Act funds that are available to the town. The lower left is our sister committee, which is the 2229 Main Street Oversight Committee. That is a group that's been in existence since the early 2000s, and they've been monitoring the technical aspects of the cleanup and commenting to EPA, and they do that to this day because there are documents being issued by EPA that task force is commenting on, that committee's commenting on. Town council has been instrumental, of course, on legal aspects and working with our team. And EPA had provided us with one of their contractors who have been involved in reuse of sites, and they've been advising us on reuse options. And so collectively, and of course you have the cleanup contractor, DeMaximus, who works for EPA. This has been a very cooperative, energetic bunch, and I wanted to thank them all. So a lot of work has gone on, and I'll get into the details in a minute, but just in one slide, I just want to emphasize that this has really been a complex undertaking along those 4 work streams. And there's been extensive research conducted to date. There's been hundreds of hours of work done by our task force and others. There have been dozens of interviews with town departments, with committees, with private parties, with developers, with contractors to get information and cost estimates and just the raw information that we need for our report. There have been conversations, very importantly, with Massachusetts town officials, other towns that have been faced with decisions on acquiring Superfund sites after cleanup. What were the pros and cons of that decision? What was involved in ownership of those sites after they acquired those? That's been very useful information to us that'll be in our report. There's been extensive work by town council. I mentioned work on the health risk funded by Mass DEP TAG grant. There's consideration of town strategic plans where they've been available. And the task force has met twice a month, much to the chagrin of some of my task force members. But we've had a lot of work to do. We've met 25 times over the past 13 months. So what have we learned? I'll take each of these areas one at a time, and I'll summarize the main findings. There are a lot of details which we don't have time to present tonight. All will be in our report, and all are open for questions and discussion this evening. But tonight I'll give you the highlights. So overall, where are we in the process? I characterize where we are. We're entering, I think, a critical stage, the critical deliberations, where we're going to start to knit together all of the information that each of the work streams has acquired, and to see where they overlap, to see how one work stream informs another, and together to arrive on our recommendations. We haven't begun to discuss our recommendations yet. The report will be drafted in the fall and will be delivered on or about Halloween. We haven't decided whether it'll be in costume or not for that. We'll ask for the select board for advice, I think. Have candy, right. Okay, so let me start out with the legal aspects. So the legal aspects of the decision to acquire or not to acquire and our recommendations, I think, represent the linchpin element. Why is that? Because if the select board is to proceed to actually acquire the site, the town must be able to acquire the site in what I call beneficial terms, beneficial financial terms, and the town has to be shielded from liability related to past operations, including the Superfund contaminants that were generated by the manufacturing, and insulated from the cost of the cleanup itself. So that is why we believe this is sort of a linchpin element. Town council has worked closely with the task force in thoroughly researching the critical elements shown here. So let's start off just briefly with the current ownership. Who owns the site? The site right now essentially has no active owners. StarMet filed for bankruptcy, liquidating all of its assets. Mass Secretary of State formally dissolved StarMet, so essentially has no active owners right now. As far as next steps on title, the town will be negotiating with EPA and Department of Justice on terms of the acquisition, should the select board decide to do so. I think it's been no secret, I think we publicized that there's a large federal lien on the site. There's an existing mortgage. These are multi-million-dollar liens that sit on the books right now. Those have to be negotiated. And we have good reason in speaking with EPA that those can be negotiated to the benefit of the town, or almost completely extinguished. That won't happen until actually negotiations take place, but that's our sense right now, that those liens can go away. The acquisition of the site itself, how we're going to acquire it. There are several methods that town council thinks that for acquiring. For example, the one mentioned in the warrant article is eminent domain. That may or may not be the best vehicle for acquiring the site, but there are multiple vehicles for acquiring the site to the benefit of the town. And part of that acquisition strategy, those liens and mortgages are likely to be forgiven or negotiated down to the benefit of the town. We don't know if those will come to zero, and we won't know until we actually sit down at the table with the EPA. But in our report to the select board, we are going to take the best information and come up with our best opinions on where that will end up. What will be the acquisition cost? We don't know. That's to be negotiated, what that acquisition costs. All of these negotiations that will occur after the initial determination to be on the path or not to be on the path, that will culminate in the acquisition costs. But we don't know what those are right now. A very important question, a key question for the town is liability protection. It's really probably the key for the town. There are several means available to address possible liability for past contamination from what I call legacy operations. EPA has written lots of articles on how municipalities can seek liability protection. And we have reason to believe that there are several means available. And we have to select those means, sit down with the EPA to make sure that the town is protected, that we have no liability for past sins, if you will. And we have to seek protection against responsibility for any claims related to past operations. So we could acquire the site, and 10 years from now, somebody could file a claim related to those Superfund contaminants. We have to make sure that it's clear that the town is not responsible for those claims that relates to something that the town has had no part of. It's all part of negotiations. I'm saying what sort of the criteria may be, but you can see right away why making a recommendation on October 31st to acquire is not possible. We have to enter into negotiations to find out these details. We are going to define for the select board the responsibility of ownership. What are the rights that the town would have as ownership? Can we sell off parts of the site in the future? Can we lease parts of the site? Are we constrained if we're owners of any rights of ownership? The town will have, after the site is cleaned up, there will be certain systems left on site, which will continue to pump water, and there'll be certain deed restrictions on the site, certain areas you can't dig in, such as the holding basin, where materials were disposed of and will be capped. So the town will have to manage those institutional controls to ensure that the remediation structures are not disturbed. There'll be, the town will have to develop permitting and inspections guarding against future problems. So the town will have to develop some systems to manage these institutional controls. And finally, insurance policy. Any insurance policy will not protect us from Superfund related issues. That will come from the liability discussions with EPA. But insofar as the town will own the site, will manage the site, will develop the site. The town needs and will seek insurance to protect the town, which is normal pollution insurance. And we're looking into getting quotes on those policies right now. But those policies are available. We just have to make sure we know what they cover. So moving on to the next stage, the reuse. So in 2021, the reuse committee developed what we call the master plan concept. And the reuse group has, through all the discussions with town officials on town needs, had come up with several different scenarios. The task force has not yet specified a specific plan. In other words, what exactly will go where on the site. It's a little premature to do that. But instead, we've identified specific needs based on research and conversations. And those are shown in the 4 different scenarios that are laid out here. And very briefly, there are 2 scenarios that are related to municipal ownership if the town acquires a site. Scenario 1 is the town acquires a site and uses it entirely for municipal purposes. Recreation, DPW, just municipal activities, town offices, purely for municipal purposes. Scenario 2 is the town acquires a site and facilitates some private use to lease parts of the site for development, for revenue generation, for example. So the town would own the site but would lease parcels for development. And then if the town chooses not to acquire the site, there are 2 different scenarios. One is a scenario where we could sit down with the unknown private party and come to some agreement that allows the town or facilitates limited town use. How that agreement would be struck is to be determined, but it's possible to negotiate with a private party for some municipal carve-out of parts of the property. It's hypothetical right now, but that's a possibility. And then scenario 4 is the town does not acquire the site and a private party acquires the site and reuses the site without any town uses or facilities. In that case, the town has normal control through zoning and bylaws as any development of any property in town. So those are the 4 overarching scenarios. And I said specific plans have not yet been developed, but concepts allow flexibility. And I mentioned scenario 1, where the town uses the site for municipal purposes. Well, here are some of the high priority municipal purposes. So you can mix and match these depending on a number of things. There could be passive recreation and trails and recreation fields. There could be solar energy production and battery storage. You could have town offices and recreational fields. You could mix and match any of these scenarios. And the important reason why we can't do this at this point is because we realize that the town has other opportunities, right? We have MCI Concord, we have Peabody School, we have other properties that have to be thrown into the mix. So for our task force to specify an exact plan without thinking about the other sites is premature, but it's not our job to do town-wide planning. So that's where we are. We need to get as much detail as we can advise the select board, but we can't do planning for how the 2229 site relates to other sites. And then I mentioned, scenario 2, where the town uses much of the site for municipal purposes, but could lease parcels for housing, could lease parcels for assisted living, could lease parcels for a privately owned recreational facility. Any one of those could result in some revenue generation through taxes. So these are sort of the overarching scenarios of the town, of the municipal ownership of the town. Another critical element of great interest and importance to the public is risk and safety. Can the site be developed and reused safely? So we know that the site became a Superfund site because the risks of contaminants that were sourced in the waste disposal and unfortunate operations of the past, what those were. But what, if any, will be the risk associated with various reuses at various locations within the site once the site is cleaned up? The town and the task force were fortunate to have been awarded this TAG grant, and Rue Associates was tasked with identifying the future conditions of the site after remediation and the risk to people associated with living, working, or recreating at the site in various areas. So their scope is pretty detailed. They're going to have a report that will be considered by and reviewed by our task force and will be included in probably as an appendix in our report. But they will evaluate, who could possibly be exposed to residual contaminants and what those exposures would be, where people would be exposed. There's cleanup going on at different stages at different parts of the site. And the when part of this is after soil and sediment remediation. So Rue has projected into the future and has evaluated the risks from these residual contaminants that may remain once cleanup is completed. And they're very fortunate to actually have some actual data, because there are areas on the site that have been cleaned up. And there's data that EPA has provided that, here are samples that represent the final cleanup, because, as I said, there's been cleanup activity. So there are areas where they have to project what the cleanup will be, and areas where they actually know what the data are. So the results have been, we've been briefed on those results, and at a very high level, the three bullets I present here. So assuming that the remediation will meet the required goals, okay? Assuming that the soils and sediments will be cleaned up at the site, and we have every reason to believe that will be accomplished, but we are tracking that. Our sister committee is tracking that. EPA is providing data on the cleanup. Assuming that the remediation will meet goals, the anticipated post-remediation exposures to the chemicals will meet all relevant federal and state risk thresholds for health and safety. They've done a very conservative analysis of the data, and this is their result to date. Conservative meaning, I'll call it worst case, areas where probably people won't live but may recreate, but they've applied a residential criteria. They've taken multiple contaminants, they've done a cumulative risk. EPA usually takes one chemical at a time and looks at risk. Rue is taking a look at the cumulative risks of multiple chemicals. So these results will be merged with a reuse work stream to determine what reuses are appropriate and suitable at what areas in the site. And that part of the work is just starting, because Rue is just completing their work. The final element is the ownership and operations. It relates to defining what happens if the town decides to acquire the site. What are the likely costs? What are the likely obligations to the town? We've developed preliminary estimates of these costs, but there's a lot more work to do. What are the costs of acquisition? Well, those, as I mentioned, won't be known until the negotiations are completed. What are the cost estimates of reuse and redevelopment? Well, the task force has gone so far, and will go so far as to estimate what is the cost of infrastructure development, water lines, septic systems, roads. But as far as the actual development, those costs and those capital costs must await the detailed planning, and that's beyond the scope of our task force. The cost estimates of town ownership, meeting obligations, regulations, institutional controls. What will it cost the town to actually manage activities on the site? Will it be existing staff? Will we have to hire other staff to do that? And what will be the cost of insurance, assuming we can get good quotes on that? How do we factor the cost of insurance? We've also looked at what are the estimates of the cost if the town is, if the site is privately owned, privately acquired. It's not cost-free for the town, because let's say there's a major housing development. Well, there are costs of a police and fire department. In conversations with those departments, there will be more people, more infrastructure, and there'll be costs to cover the safety of those people. And there'll be costs of oversight of the development, private development. Mention the responsibilities of ownership, the costs of managing those institutional controls, those deed restrictions to make sure that nothing is disturbed at the site, and the cost of state and federal regulation adherence. So all these costs will be estimated in our report. And then we will make an attempt at rough estimates of revenue generation. It's possible to do that, but they're highly uncertain because, as I mentioned, we don't know what's going to be developed at the site. But we're now entering the conversation. FinCom has asked us to look at that. We'll see how far we can take those revenue generation estimates. So that's kind of the overview. I will finish with just some key dates, and these key dates are tentative because I think the timeline is really important. Let's start with our report. October 31st, 2024, we submit our report with the recommendations. I think early next year, Q1 and Q2, and this is my personal estimates based on what I think may evolve. I haven't consulted with the select board on this at all, but I think it's reasonable that the select board considers the task force recommendation. If a recommendation is made to acquire the site, the select board decides whether to move forward on negotiations and or further information gathering to make the final decision on the actual acquisition. And those negotiations will take some time. It'll probably be 25, 2026, maybe into 27 before the negotiations are complete, assuming they are successful. During that time, in parallel, we hope that there will be planning and reuse activity. I mentioned that there's planning for the town for multiple sites. So during that period of time, the town will have to figure out, okay, the task force made these recommendations. What are we actually going to do at the site? And what are those costs going to be? So that's part of the reuse planning and budgeting, which is probably 2025, 26 through 7. Late 27 and 28, the cleanup will be sufficiently complete according to EPA. That's their timeline. And at that point, the EPA issues a SWARU. It's one of my favorite acronyms, Site-Wide Ready for Anticipated Use. This is a document that EPA basically says the cleanup is complete. It can be ready for reuse. Nobody can reuse the site until that SWARU is written by EPA, which basically says, in this case, the soil and sediment, anything on the surface, and the holding basin is complete. Early 2028, first steps of reuse and redevelopment can begin, the first steps. And then 2029 to 30, by the end of the decade, we could start seeing some reuse actually occurring. So we're in 2024. We're going to be the end of 2024 before the recommendation. The next 6 years, we have time. We have time to make the final decisions. We have time. The select board has time to negotiate. There's time to plan. Our job is just to advise them on which direction, which pathway to go down, and what that pathway may be. So with that, I thank you much. That's sort of the 10,000-foot update on where we are and where we're going. And at that point, we'll take any questions or comments. Just come to the mic and.
Hi, my name is Mary Hartman. I'm the chair of the select board, speaking on my own behalf. I've got 29 questions in my head right now, but I'll try to stick with 2. The first question I have is, if the select board decides not to move with further exploration into acquisition, and it's disposed of some other way by the DOJ, I guess, and the only way the town could control the property at that point would be through zoning. Do I understand that correctly? And have we looked at how's it zoned now, and what zoning changes could we make because we've run into the same issue with MCI. Okay, so we want to be able to control what happens there through zoning if we need to. And we are finding out that that's a little tricky because there's such a thing as spot zoning. You can't just take one piece of land and say, we're going to zone this specifically. So I guess I'm asking, my first question is, have you researched what would be available to us to control this property if we decide not to acquire it? And what do we have available to us through zoning? That's my first question. And shall I stop?
Does anybody want to address that?
Yeah, we actually started on that path, looking at all of the potential zoning alternatives in the town of Concord zoning bylaw.
Yes.
For each of the various areas, redevelopment areas on the site. And I'm Gary Kleiman, by the way. I formerly was on the planning board, so I'm sort of familiar with some of the procedures and the prohibitions against spot zoning. So we were looking at alternatives for rezoning individual areas on the site. And then we sort of moved on, and Rich and I are working together on the reuse workstream. We moved more towards developing the reuse scenarios. And our plan had been during this period of integration, once we have the report from RU that identifies which areas are safe for which activities, once we have the legal information from the acquisition or not acquisition legal work stream, and once we have information from the operations and management side as to what the costs are, we were then going to return to the zoning alternatives to try and develop in parallel with our final report and recommendations, what would zoning alternatives that the planning board could consider look like that would be consistent with the scenarios that we had developed. So we wanted to wait until we could integrate all of this other information before we went further with zoning, but as part of the October 31st plan, I think there would be some recommendations. It's obviously the planning board's mandate, not ours,
Right.
to develop new and revised zoning, and that would have to happen, but presumably would happen before 2029 or 2028 when the cleanup is complete. But yeah.
Add one thing. One of the things that the reuse group did was research out there in the development community who would want it and how would they want to use it. So there's that guide toward these questions there. I mean, they researched the market for the
Right.
land. So if you want to zone it, you kind of want to know who's going to want to come in and do what with it. There will be some information in the report about that too.
Okay.
It's a good point, and the thing that we haven't done as a reuse workstream, because probably it involves the entire task force weighing in and deliberating on this, so it'll be coming up in one of our public meetings, is based on that demand, do we want to make recommendations to not allow zoning? That we could make that recommendation even if there is demand for something that we perhaps don't want there. But my personal opinion, that probably is more in the planning board's domain, but we do have this information, as he said, so that could contribute to the planning board's decisions.
Okay, this is complicated. I just kind of wanted to understand what are our options if we decide not to acquire it. What can zoning do for us? Okay, so it's complicated. My second question is, if we decide to acquire it, and one of your scenarios was a mixed thing, would be some municipal and some, you mentioned leasing it to a private developer, right? I'm assuming that we could also consider selling it to a private developer, using those funds to therefore make a capital improvement in the land that you've kept for municipal purposes. So have you thought that through as far as selling as opposed to leasing?
There's the legal, well, right now, I'll just say the EPA would like a single purchaser, so they're looking for somebody to acquire the site. The rights of ownership have to be negotiated. Do we have the right to do what you say? Pam? Do you wanna?
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. I want to just add an additional possibility that is being explored and isn't being projected as a particularly likely one, but it's the right of first refusal because we do have an interest in what would happen if some additional party were to acquire the site. It is possible, we are looking at the ability for us to step in and say, we have a right of first refusal on that. So that's one thing. On the question of developing and using it for our own beneficial purposes as part of the site or leasing, to the extent that we enjoy what EPA might call a windfall, to the extent that we might enjoy a financial gain from selling, from whatever we do that comes from the work and the money spent by the general public through taxes and the EPA, that we would have to negotiate a windfall agreement with.
So it would be to our advantage to lease, which is why you mentioned leasing. Do we have to share with the EPA some of the benefit that we got from leasing? Or is that,
Again,
would that?
your point, your astute observation was the complexity of all of this.
Right.
And
Okay.
and I think that, you know, those are the kinds of questions that would be ill-considered for us to try to do a quick.
Yeah, and Mary, we had a meeting, we've had conversations with EPA and DOJ, open conversations, not negotiations, about this federal lien. So this federal lien is probably $100 million more. The federal lien is basically all the costs of the Army and the Department of Energy. So, and EPA knows they can't recover that, but they don't want an owner to sell off parts or all of the site and just make profit. So they will want to negotiate some sharing of that kind of revenue. What those negotiations look like and how town council balances that versus other facts is yet to be determined. We've heard from them that they want to share in that type of windfall or that type of revenue generation.
Okay, thank you.
Pam Rockwell, 1810 Main Street. So I was interested in the idea of the liability issues versus the town negotiating the liability issues versus a private developer negotiating the liability issues. You know, could we just let some private person deal with it, and then maybe if we really felt it was being used poorly, go ahead and take control of it again? Or is there an advantage to having the town actually be the first one negotiating the liability issues? Is there benefit for the town versus a developer to negotiate the liability left at the site by the new owner?
What I know, town council will have to give you the official answer, but the EPA affords municipalities and potential municipal owners layers of liability protection that probably private developers cannot get. So I think it's the advantage, you know, if ultimately the goal is for us to own the site, I think we have to be sitting at the table, because a private party doing that negotiations will not be able to avail themselves of some written advantageous liability protections. That's what I know. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think there's any advantage of a private party trying to negotiate liability protections. I think municipalities can do that much more effectively.
Well, I just was thinking of the Ashland Nyanza site, where private developers, they owned the places that were cleaned up anyway. They tried to develop a big housing development there that the local town was uncomfortable with, and Ashland ended up going back and buying property there, purchasing the property so they could control it, because they couldn't just control it with zoning. Is that true with the liability too, that whatever those private developers negotiated for liability is also the limit of the liability that a town coming in as this back later would have? Or
Good question. I'm not sure there are any answers.
I think Paul, you're making an excellent point, that the town municipal entities owners have terrible liability exposure as Superfund owners. That's in the law, and it's a very basic component of the draconian liability scheme that Superfund offers, which is actually a very powerful scheme. But as Paul said, the municipal entities enjoy protections, as do bona fide prospective purchasers, as do purchasers who buy under certain conditions. So I think the benefit to the town of being in the liability negotiation phase is advantageous. Which is in part why I mentioned the right of first refusal as well, because you might come to a situation where, as you have described about Ashland, where you're innocent, you didn't buy, you didn't take over, and then you end up holding a bag you didn't want to hold.
so EPA is planning on cleaning this site up so that basically all of it that isn't wetlands can be redeveloped as residential. Is there any protection is there any way for Concord to zone it so that it doesn't turn into yet another one of these big 40B developments? Like the ones that's backing up to it at Forest Ridge Road or the one on Baker Avenue?
Go ahead.
Zone it industrial, the aspirations we did said that the developer would be interested in housing. And there are examples of developers in Massachusetts who have acquired superfund sites and built over housing. I think the interesting question is going to be if there's commercial interest, once commercial development possible, choosing something, because that's much better site for traffic.
So,
So that is also is the reason that we can't plan for both. The short answer is, yeah, private sector could acquire with some liability protections, and they have done it in Massachusetts.
just, what personal opinion based on a lay's person readings of the tea leaves and EPA documents, it's going to be very difficult for a private party to acquire the site and get over this $150 million lien. I think the EPA they're anxious for the town to consider ownership, and they're anxious to figure out how to forgive this lien. Would they do that with a private party? I'm not sure. If we'd like a private party to be involved, I think scenario 2 would be, which is, we acquire and we lease it to a private party so that we can control that directly, because we're leasing it. That would probably be the most direct way to control what actually happens at the site. Personal opinion. Any dissenting opinions? Court.
I was waving goodbye to our colleague.
Oh, you're waving goodbye. Okay, next question.
Mary Weinberg, Hillside Avenue. I just came tonight to represent someone who used to be on the committee and because of ill health is not on it anymore. And by chance, after I'd gone to your previous meetings, I had Googled Nuclear Metals StarMet Reuse Planning Committee and the agenda for May 29th, 2020. And I found Jim Burns, who used to be on it, and I just want this in the record. It was the meeting on May 29th, 2020. And my notes, forgive me, they're not too good. I was trying to watch it and take notes of what Jim said. Jim's responsibility was to explore in the country what was being done. And this is what he said. He said, no one used public housing on nuclear waste sites. He said he spent a lot of time on houses built on radiation activities. He found not one in the country. And again, I hope everybody looks at May 29, 2020. If I've said some wrong things, you will see what he said. I believe he said, the people said, we'll use it for land looking good. He also said he had spent a lot of time looking at buildings on Superfund sites and across the country, and he was reported back. He said people said, even though the government cleaned it up, quote, he said they would never, want nothing to do with that. So I just want to bring to tonight, and hope our select people and everybody involved will look at May 29, 2020 to see what Jim said that night. I met Jim Burns and Cynthia McElwain, his wife, who was the daughter of Dana Greeley at First Parish. I met them both in 1989 when we were working on the West Concord Depot train station, and they're both wonderful, smart, insightful people. So I just thought I would bring this to light, what Jim had said. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's something really important, Mary, that your comment brings up, and the town needs to understand. The word uranium and the word radiation they evoke concern. They should. There is no radiological risk at this site. The depleted uranium that remains in the holding basin, which will be capped and all sorts of things, is a toxin if you ingest it. But the risk is not radiological. There's no radiation stuff around without getting into the science. So though those words are associated with the site, with Superfund and chemicals and all of these words of concern, on the actual risk assessment level, the only thing that's left of uranium is depleted, where they've taken most of the active stuff out in the first place, and it's in the holding basin, and its only toxicity is if you ingest it, which is why we're going to cap the basin. So when you compare it to other radiological sites, it's apples and oranges, as Jim was doing at the time, probably. In our case, though those scary words are associated with it, the actual risk, the radiological risk, as I understand it, isn't there. The words are there, but when you actually look at the stuff on the ground, it's not.
Pam Rockwell, Main Street. So I actually worked on the committee with Jim, as did several members of this committee do that. And I should point out that Jim's big contribution to that site was pushing to not eliminate housing as a possibility at that site. There are parts of that site that have never been contaminated, and like many of us who were on that committee, we felt like you can't just eliminate those as possibilities when housing is such a need in Concord. And it is being cleaned up to a residential cleanup, that you shouldn't just rule those things out. So even though he didn't find areas that were equivalent to compare this to, because there just aren't those kinds, there are certainly plenty of sites that have been cleaned up and used for residential areas that have a similar risk at the site, where they will also have areas like pump and treat to clean up the groundwater at that site, areas that have landfills that are isolated that shouldn't be dug up for any reason. There are comparable sites that this committee and the previous committee have looked at that you can say those are safe for housing. And I think it's, Jim was one of the people that voted that we should make a recommendation that the site be redeveloped by the town. So that's actually, I think pulling just that particular piece of what Jim said, I mean, he's not here to actually say that, but we all appreciated a lot of, Jim worked hard on that committee and was a big part of the report that was written, so.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. And don't lose sight of the fact that we are doing a scientific risk assessment of what the site is going to look like. And it's based on both plans and data. And it's a very conservative approach that Rue is taking. So we're going to be using objective results to evaluate various areas of the site. To Pam's point, this is not a homogeneous site. There are areas that there was disposal, areas that were never contaminated, areas where there were just buildings and workers. So we can't treat this as one uniform site, but we are looking at risks in different areas to see if any one area exceeds thresholds that we'd be uncomfortable with. Thus far, the answer is no, they don't.
Rick or Frederick Olson. I'm actually a radiation biologist, a PhD degree. There is, to your point, I agree with you about the radiological hazards, pretty much nil, but inhalation of dust material that could come up on the site could be an issue from lung and other absorption methods through that means. So there is other routes of exposure that could be a concern. I'm a little concerned, I guess I have been for a while, that, and I really pushed hard, as the crew team knows and 2229 Main Street know, of being really careful about the cleanup to residential standards. And during the process of cleanup, that other exposure isn't going to happen, which I think has been controlled fairly well to date. But part of me is a little skeptical of how safe it really will be. As a toxicologist, as a radiation biologist, there's different levels genetically and otherwise, an age for sensitivities to heavy metals. And this is a heavy metal toxic issue because it's not just depleted uranium there. There's beryllium. There's other very serious heavy metals on site. I'm very happy that RAU is doing a combination risk assessment, that's what needs to be done because all these metals have some overlapping toxicity, potential safety issues. So even though we've pushed hard to get it done to residential standards, I'm a little skeptical, is it going to be safe enough for all potential uses, particularly different age groups, young children, babies, whatever. So I think we got to think about that carefully.
Thank you for the comment. Go ahead.
Great points. So one of the things as a toxicologist you'll know is when a risk assessment is done on any kind of a suspected something, they look at what does it do to you, at what dose, at what age, by what route of exposure. So for example, this one floored me when I learned it. You could get plutonium on your skin and it wouldn't do anything to you. You ingest it or inhale it, you're dead. So the route of exposure, there are 3 of them that the actual risk assessment looks at. So they're looking at inhalation and they're looking at ingestion for all of the suspect materials on the site that the EPA identified, all of them, dozens, if not hundreds, I don't know exactly the number. So first of all, they're looking at all the routes. Second of all, and I just spoke to them to clarify this in my mind yesterday, they have also broken these assessments down by age. So they're not looking for a standard 160-year-old white guy, 160-pound white guy, which is the way they used to do it. They're breaking it down in age brackets. So when they say residential and you could live there for 70 years and not increase your risk of cancer by more than 1 in a million, stuff like that, they include kids, right, who developmentally have all kinds of different exposure mechanisms. That is also built into the risk assessment that's being done. So is there a guarantee of safety? Safety is in the eye of the beholder in the end, right? But this is the Cadillac job.
One other point is the cleanup itself is being extended down to a depth of 10 feet below ground for residential exposure. Oh, sorry. One other point is just from a practical standpoint on the remediation, the residential standards are being met to 10 feet below ground surface, which is extremely conservative compared to many other sites where most residential exposures are in the upper couple feet of soil. So I think that's just another layer of conservatism that's being added in.
Just my clarification, I didn't mean to say, I don't think it's what you said, but I did mean to say, we've seen certain things that are being done that raise some questions. Is it being done well enough to understand the levels? And I think there's always that uncertainty. There's going to be some uncertainty, so it's not a guarantee.
Also, remember that, so there is well over 100,000 cubic yards of soil going to be removed from the site. It's going to be replaced by 100,000 cubic yards of clean soil. EPA is looking for clean soil. They won't just take anything. The folks at Warner's Pond said, if we dredge Warner's Pond, will you take that? They won't take that. It's more because it's silty than anything else, but they're very particular what they're going to put in the top 10 feet of soil.
My name is Tim Rose. I'm a longtime member of CREW since 1980, I guess. My concern is almost exactly the opposite of what we're talking about, and that is with the people now questioning everything about science, there always are going to be people who say, I don't care how clean it is, I never want to go on that site for any reason. And my question is, have you looked at any others, or are there any other sites that have been cleaned up that had, quote, radioactivity associated with it? And is it not impossible that all of a sudden you would find out this is unmarketable, that no one wants to pick it up, and that the town itself, well, the town employees perhaps don't want to work in a building like that? So I'm just worried about sort of the psychological aspect of this. I happen to have no problem at all with it. My wife is on the completely opposite side. She would never go on it under any circumstances.
Site just off the top of my head that I'm somewhat familiar with. The Rocky Flats site in Colorado, is anybody familiar with that? Okay, that was dosed with all kinds of junk, including radiological and metals and toxins and all sorts of stuff. It's currently, they take classes there now. It was preserved as open space, not for housing, but it is one of the most popular areas in Denver for bringing classes to see wildlife, because the wildlife's thriving because there's no people around. So there are plenty of examples. That's just one. There's something around Oak Ridge, but I'm not going to cite it really specifically enough to talk about. But there's some of the Oak Ridge property that I know is now also in open use. There are also, in Massachusetts, Ashland was mentioned, for example, Salem. We have looked into several other communities that have faced exactly these questions. And by the way, Mary, they're available, and they will be in our appendix for how they did it, with contact names and informations, you know. So if we forgot to ask them something, or something comes up in negotiations, you'll know who to contact. But there are radiological and other really messy sites in Massachusetts. The Wells G&H sites in, the famous civil action sites in Woburn, yeah? Open land, skating rink, hotel, all sorts of things. The thing that, not specifically radioactivity.
So,
Yes, it does have a unique one, and that absolutely has to be recognized by the town. But again, if one respects that concern and then has a conversation like I had with Mary about radiation, when you look at the actual stuff that's there, though the word is associated with what we think, smart people in Concord can look at the evidence too. There is nothing radiological about this site. So that's a conversation that we can have with people who have that concern. Whether it completely allays their concern is for them to judge. Their concern is their concern, and it's valid. And these fears are very deep, and they're psychological. But the evidence that we're looking into does allay those concerns and speak to potential future use.
Is there any, for anything on Zoom, any questions on Zoom? Any hand raise?
can I
May
speak?
may I say, I think we need to, we're looking, everybody's describing acceptable risk. What is being described as acceptable risk, and aspiring to residential standards. I do think it's important to honor the skepticism. I mean, this is, after all, an MPL site. It's a highly toxic site. And I think the level of certainty that some people may want may simply not exist for those people. And I think we all need to understand the limits of science on the risk certainty side as well. And I think that our own risk assessors, as I'm sure you understand, have cautioned us about this sort of stuff.
I just want to again say I've been a member of Crew for as long as I can remember, working with Tim and the group, and was head of Crew for over 15 years. My father was a health physicist. He actually got stock in nuclear metals, so he could circuitously get involved with their stockholder meetings and consult with Pam. So, and we had the house closest to the site. I had to do an autopsy on my father to look for potential contaminants. It was quite bizarre. But, I have had a lot of experience with risk assessment. And I do think what has been done to clean this site up, which is a very complex site, has been remarkable. But, I always have I got to always have a little bit of uncertainty as a scientist. But I do believe it will be, and we pushed hard for residential standards. That was a big push. But, I think this site is going to be safe. But you can't guarantee anything, and then we have to really be aware of that.
Yeah, I'll just say our task force.
I just want to comment on Tim's comment.
Yeah.
I had to sell my mother's house, okay, right when it became a Superfund site, when she died. So there is a perception, whether it's really true or not, that is going to be an issue. So,
So let me just say, I think it's the job of the task force to take the information that we have and make informed judgments based on facts and science. That's the best we can do. There will be psychological issues. People either won't believe the results or won't walk on the site. Look, cell towers, there'd be a never-ending debate about cell towers. The never-ending debates about many things that people perceive as being dangerous. And that's kind of the way it is. So, but we have to use the evidence that we have and make informed judgments. And that's what we're going to do. And be transparent to the public of how we're making those judgments.
So none of the other Superfund sites in Massachusetts were radiological Superfund sites, but the Arsenal in Watertown, the Watertown Arsenal, they had a building, they used depleted uranium, they used solvents. The building was contaminated in their ventilation system with uranium and with other materials that had to be removed. That's the site. It is next door to Arsenal Mall. So the same way the parking lot at StarMet might get redeveloped someday as something else, that was developed as Arsenal Mall. I'm sure nobody here thinks when they go to Arsenal Mall, oh my goodness, it's radiological next door. The building itself was gutted, cleaned out, redeveloped. It is office space. People work there. People do not seem to remember that this used to be a toxic site that they have to worry about. It's down the street from the DMV. We actually more need to think that we need to be sure that this site that people do have the respect for this site in the future, because people will forget that it used to be contaminated. I think, yes, it's something to overcome for the first few years, but that this was something that had every chemical that you could imagine, in addition to having depleted uranium, exactly the chemicals that we're looking at. And people now don't even remember that used to be a toxic waste site. So,
I'd like to add one thing about the feelings business and the psychology. Your wife's not here, Tim? Your wife's not here. One of the reasons that I'm on the committee is to have conversations with people like your wife. So I'm going to ask you all to bring to the task force awareness of the people who have these concerns, so we can have these conversations, so that we can demonstrate a respect for the feelings, tell them what our science is, do it in a transparent way that builds trust, hopefully, and therefore the influence of our information, so that their concerns are respected intimately. So please let us know. I mean, I've done a bunch of asking around town. I've had a handful of conversations, but gosh, I know I've missed tons of folks. Just met you tonight. We want to have those conversations to help people get to the scientific understanding.
Okay, next question.
Nancy James, Walden Terrace. Beryllium was mentioned. And of the two former employees with whom I spoke, one said depleted uranium is not the problem. Beryllium was the problem. And there are 2 employee deaths of beryllium poisoning on that particular site during operational times. So I wanted to bring that to your attention.
Thank you. And there was beryllium at the site. It is not one of the contaminants of concern from all the various investigations, all the analyses that have been done, but there were beryllium issues for workers at the site. I think people working at the site in some of those buildings is a different issue than people recreating and potentially living here in 2030. So it's quite different.
Hi, I'm Janet Benvenuti, Jonas Brown Circle. I'm concerned about future liability. A couple of items. David, I know you cut your teeth on Woburn's situation with kids dying from leukemia. I was raised in Woburn at the time of those events, and I just happened to live on West Woburn. So I am also a trained nuclear chemist. I worked for Textron during the time they were creating self-forging munitions that used depleted uranium. So this is old news for me. and I have a few questions. The first is, I'm concerned about the holding basin. I binge watched all of your recordings, poured through some of the EPA documents. I find it fun since I'm in healthcare now and I'm away from the bench. But we lined this pit, right? And now we're going to build a 90-foot wall around it and then cap it. And as far as the messaging goes, it's clean. It is not 100% impermeable. It's 90 to 99%. The half-life of depleted uranium, I'm sure you've had this conversation, is 4.5 billion years. That toxic soup is going to be emitting radioactivity forever. The iron that's thrown in to make it sediment, that's great. It makes it less soluble in water. But Concord, if we own that site, we're going to have to monitor what's going on with that holding basin, because some of this is going to leach into the soil. We're going to have to monitor the water that's migrating over toward Acton. And I guess the question is, have we factored that into the costs going forward?
Let me answer part of that. So the responsibility for monitoring is EPA's. EPA will be at this site for decades.
Will they be liable for it? Will they hold the liability in the future? They won't, right? The town is going to be liable, correct?
We will not acquire the site, and we get a release of liability for those Superfund chemicals that I mentioned earlier, including everything in the holding basin. Let me just say about the holding basin, the risk of depleted uranium is to the deep groundwater, not the surface. That deep groundwater is not accessible, and one of the institutional controls will be that groundwater will not be used at the site. So nobody's going to use this groundwater. Nobody's going to penetrate the cap. It is going to be in place. It will not be clean. It'll be stabilized. It'll be sequestered. It'll be capped. That's the point. So it won't be clean, but it'll be stabilized. It will not pose a risk to groundwater, and certainly nothing.
The second
Don't forget, Janet,
yes.
a risk requires exposure.
Oh, I
So
understand.
the way to deal with that
I'm
one is
well
not to
versed
clean
in
it
all
and make
this.
it all go on, but to limit exposure.
One of the things that also caught my attention is that the bog has PCBs, mercury, lead. So that caught my attention because that implies that, again, we have a forest area that has never been used and therefore must not be contaminated. And I'm curious, was any of that area tested?
Yes.
It was
extensively tested.
Okay.
There is an area of the bog where that oblique drone view, you saw some black tar. If you go downhill, there's a corner of the bog that's going to be excavated. It's been extensively analyzed, and that area will be removed, that area. The rest of the bog is uncontaminated.
And then the
But
final
let me just,
question.
I want to
Go
repeat
ahead.
again, the responsibility for monitoring the effectiveness and the efficacy of the cleanup is EPA's in perpetuity. It will not be the responsibility or the responsibility of the town to do that monitoring or the costs of it. And the management, the operation and maintenance of those systems is EPA's responsibility. Our responsibility is just don't mess with those systems. Don't let anybody dig in the holding basin. Don't let anybody knock over one of the pumping systems that'll have a small footprint. So I think we found that the division of responsibilities is pretty clear, but it has to be all negotiated. We have to get this all in writing.
Sure.
In great detail to protect us in the future.
And the final concern I have, like I think others have voiced, is housing versus other uses. I know you're doing that kind of level of risk assessment, but given my childhood and given the fact that, it is an area that has a lot of metals and other contaminants potentially, it's something I would be a little more cautious about. But thank you. And thank you very much for all the work that's been done on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Let's just, can we go on Zoom? Excuse me? Oh,
Pamela
sorry.
Dritt.
Pam Dritt, are you on Zoom? Do you have a question?
13 Concord Green. Yes, I grew up in Oak Ridge, and I'm familiar. Also, I looked at an old watch factory in Waltham to try and think of a development there, thinking about a development there, and it turned out it was contaminated with radioactive from the watch paint for the glow-in-the-dark watches that were made many years ago. People were hurt. As we get more aware of what the issues with pollution are, things that we didn't think were a danger become a danger. One of the advantages about a site like this is we know what's on there. It's not going to be a surprise. For example, like arsenic in applesauce for babies was a surprise from pesticides on agricultural land. Even in organic orchards, you can have arsenic and other such things that are dangers, and heavy metals that the military used depleted uranium shells. We messed up all of Iraq in the war. Kids ingesting things. Also, Agent Orange to defoliate Vietnam. This is much less of a danger, and we don't have the liability for it. I think it's a no-brainer that Concord, the most expensive problem we have in development here in Concord, is the cost of land and the availability of land. Here we have an opportunity to use the lands nearly for free to do all kinds of things appropriate to the various areas on that land without having to worry about finding future pollution that is going to cause us as the town a problem. I think it's absolutely we should take it. We can use the areas that should be protected and never built on for things like the utilities battery that we're going to put in, solar panels, parking for electric school buses, all kinds of things, as well as parks and community centers, not just residences. The last thing we want is to give this prime location to a developer, it seems to me.
Okay, well, thank you for thoughtful comments. Thank you, Pam. Anybody else on Zoom? Nope.
I do want to remind everybody who doesn't know, Nuclear Metal Site and W.R. Gray Site on Knox Trail are both in West Concord. In the 50s, the town of Concord allowed nuclear metals come in, early 60s. I don't know what year W.R. Grace came in. Now we know what happened. Again, I don't know if any other part of Concord ever has, which we always talk about the same place, West Concord. I moved to West Concord, and it just occurred to me tonight that we have seen what happened, letting nuclear metals and W.R. Grace comes in. And I know Paul and the scientists are not gonna like what I say, but it's just, you know, a woman's thinking. We mothers always think ahead before the child falls. It's contaminated. We fix it, we build on it. What is the message we're giving for the future? That You can come in, I'm just, remember, come in contaminated, but we'll redo it. What are we saying for the future generations? So it just occurred to me.
Yeah.
Do you understand my point?
Oh, I do.
Okay.
There are laws and regulations and morals and ethics and responsibility that weren't in place in the 50s and 60s.
Right, but now they are, and I'm saying that now what we decide, if we're going to build on this, we are saying that, and this is an ethics course, it's okay, we'll fix it. That's what I mean. We're continuing, that's in the future something else will come in and they'll do something, but yet it's fixable. It's just like when people commit a crime, they have to pay for it. I'm just saying, are we opening up the future so it can happen again, but it will be fixable? It's just, I just thought of it now.
Thank you.
Michael Amster, Prairie Street. A number of years ago, as an environmental health and safety professional, I used to do air sampling in buildings in homes that had been treated with urea formaldehyde foam. And what I found was that the levels of formaldehyde were extremely low to non-detected. And at the same time, I was in the process of relocating. And we found out that the companies that were supporting the reloads would not reload somebody's home, new people, into a home that had urea formaldehyde foam, regardless of what the data was. So I've been hearing about all the discussion here about what's happening in the town. But let's take a look at the fact that if I were moving in from a wherever, and I was emotional, and I'm a professional at this, so I understand what David is talking about and everybody else. But the fact of the matter is that who is going to intentionally move into a place where there was a toxic waste site, a hazardous waste site? And oh, by the way, the greatest source of radiation in town is actually the hospital.
And the bedrock.
You mean radon?
Radon.
Okay. Anyway, and then somebody said, well, there are regulations. Well, most of these regulations came about because somebody, the business, didn't do what they were supposed to do. Superfund, Hooker Chemical, Love Canal. Well, don't build on this portion of land. So somebody, in their infinite lack of wisdom, built a school on that hazardous waste site, and then we had Hooker Chemical and we had Superfund, and that's where that happened. Most of the regulations that we see these days, environmental regulations, are as a result of the business doing something to try to get away with something, and it doesn't work. So ultimately, the people, we, us, the government, has to pay to clean this up. So I guess my point here is that whatever we do here, we need to make sure that whoever is overseeing what's going on or what should be going on is held accountable, because you can't really depend on people doing the right thing. They'll do the right thing as long as it's financially acceptable, but there has to be some oversight to make sure that in fact, the right thing, what they're supposed to be doing, actually happens. Thank you.
Thank you. I will say the oversight here is by the federal district court. The consent decree is the oversight. That's the hammer that makes sure that that the work is done, that there's trust fund, that the people responsible for the contamination are held accountable, and that EPA continues to monitor the remediation, then nobody's going to walk away from the site. So there is accountability. Is it sufficient?
Being the eternal pessimist, I'm just saying that there has to be an ironclad oversight.
Let me reassure you in two senses. First of all, you're absolutely right that words like Superfund and chemicals and radiation and uranium, as your wife indicates, Tim, are stigmatized Tim, right? Yeah, are stigmatized with fear, and that has to be respected. That having been said, as Pam and I and others who have researched it, there are sites all over the country that have gone past that stigma and are productively in use. But what really helped all the communities that we talked about wasn't just the law. It was the trustworthiness of the people who were representing you in doing the due diligence and the oversight in advising them. It's Pam's committee, it's your neighbors. It's not the big federal government just, and the law just. It's people who live in Thoreau Hills. It's your neighbors have, and will continue to, scrupulously look at all of these risk issues. So there's a trust question that arises, and in all the communities that are reusing property, including, by the way, Pam mentioned the radium place in Waltham, it's being reused. There was a long relationship building process between the town officials and the people who had concern that built up trust in their oversight. That's going to be a real critical recommendation to the select board, whatever goes forward on this site.
Well, it still goes back to what Reagan said, trust but verify.
Well, but we do have our committees and the citizens involved in here. That we are verifying as best we can. Really, I think the point about trust in your neighbors and, citizens, butters. I live in Thoreau Hills. My 2 daughters live in Thoreau Hills. My 5 grandkids live in Thoreau Hills. I'm very aware of what's going on. I've been aware. I'm just one of many people you saw the history of when Crew started and through all the committees. We have eyes on this site, and we have the courts.
Kathy Cucolo, Katarina Heights. I'm on the Finance Committee, but I'm speaking for myself. Last week, I had an opportunity to do a site visit with members of the task force. And while I was there, there was a representative from the EPA and the gentleman who did the presentation.
DeMaximus, who was the contract, DeMaximus, Bruce
Yes,
Thompson.
The contractor. Yes. He did a presentation together with the EPA in terms of the procedures and the testing and the methods. I came away with it very impressed, so I might suggest that information may be a good presentation. I think they did it in about 40 minutes for the town, for folks to know what are the controls and balances there. I thought it was good.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Bruce and EPA are very open to site visits. I don't want to overburden them, and maybe you want to go on the site, maybe you don't, but to see what's being done there and to talk to Bruce and the intensity of the work and the care of the work. You can see PowerPoint slides, but when you're out there looking, it's impressive. A couple more questions, and then.
Janet Miller, 1647 Main Street. I'm on the Climate Action Committee, but I speak for myself. If there is housing built on this land and people want to put in ground source heat pumps, you said that some areas at least there's restrictions on digging. Would that be a problem? How much housing could have ground source heat pumps?
Well, just geographically, I don't think we know what the limits are in housing. It really depends on where it is. And remember, housing, you're going to have 10 feet of soil. So I think we don't know of any limits right now. But
Janet, one of the things that will be done in the institutional controls is policing who can dig how deep where. So there's like a dig safe program, dig safe, don't dig up the pipes in your backyard. So if anything has to go below 10 feet and it's in an area that's been mapped and so forth and we know what's up, it will be demarked as you can't dig there or you can. Most of it will be okay, but that is a risk. That has been factored into the ongoing institutional controls and not really limiting for most of the property.
I could just add, once again, until the cleanup is complete, we won't know the exact areas of the site where the 10-foot restriction is. But even with that 10-foot restriction, it is possible to submit what's called the soil management plan if you can demonstrate to the EPA that you'll safely dig and test the soil and dispose of it in a reasonable way. You can get permission to dig below 10 feet, subject to the EPA approval. Now, whether that would be cost prohibitive, to put in a heat pump, but, there is a process by which one can safely dig below 10 feet if you need to.
Okay, thank you.
As they've investigated the site, originally the thought was anything deeper than 10 feet is a no-go zone. But as they've been digging, they've been finding it's more of a patchwork. And so the Institute controls the maps that will be turned over to the town that'll basically say, or turned over to the owner, areas that would require a sediment management plan will be not a uniform area, it'll be selective areas that'll be well mapped out. So is the site in a little better shape than they thought it was? To some extent it is. I think it's getting late. It's 8:45. It's been a good discussion. I think the comments on risk and on trust and verify, I think are well grounded, and we will take those into consideration in our report. I think our report, to the extent possible, will have to assure that our opinions are based on thought and reason and experience of others, and we're going to try to get as much information as we can out to you. If you do have any questions, we have an email address on the website. Comments can be sent to that email address, and we will answer those questions so that we can. So the dialogue doesn't end here, and I do think we're talking about other ways of engaging the public, even outside these public forums. It's very important to us to hear these comments. So.
If you have findings of data, gmail.com, I'll ferry the questions to whomever is appropriate on the task force. We're listening and wanting it.
Thank you very much for attending. Thank you for the task force for all the hard work that's gone into these slides.